And we'll get started with our Science Yoga Sunday. If people are joining in as we speak, we'll go ahead and greet them and say hello. But thank you to everyone that's joining in now or watching the replay link later. My name's Julie, and I'm here with Dr. Garrett, and we're going to geek out today on hip openers. And before we get into that, I wanted to give you a background on why it's called Science Yoga Sunday, like how this came to be, and then you guys can learn about our backgrounds and get a sense of how passionate we are about yoga. It's like having the Charlie Rose show. Garrett, do you know who Charlie Rose is?
Oh man, just like vaguely.
Okay, I might be giving my age away, but so Charlie Rose, you could say he's an interviewer, but he likes to call himself a conversationalist. And this show was on PBS, and he would have the gray blazer, he'd have his coffee mug, and he would sit in this dark room with a big black
With the
round
big
table,
right? Yeah.
and then he would interview and have a conversation with someone, and it was a very nice and frank discussion every time.
That's the best way
And
to have one.
yeah, except I don't have a big dark room or a big camera. I have my webcam and I have
Maybe one
I
day.
have these
Maybe one day.
earbuds. So
You have to start somewhere.
yeah, what would MacGyver do?
Yeah, in a hostel in Moscow, I think is suitable for that answer.
Yeah. Oh, and for you guys that are wondering why I'm in Moscow, so I used to be a yoga teacher. I was teaching for about 5 years in San Francisco, and before that in LA. And my husband and I, we decided to take advantage of this opportunity to travel around the world. So instead of being a teacher all the time, I got to be a student, and I wanted to learn from amazing teachers like Garrett about not only there's a traditional side of yoga, but there's also the modern science part, and bridging the gap between the two so that way we could maintain a really long and healthy yoga practice. I think that's something it's a little bit underground right now because there's that dedication to the traditional, um, but the more science that we learn, the more we can really enjoy this. So
Yeah.
like, why not? So I'm stoked to be here with Garrett. I'm gonna pass it over to Garrett to give you a background about himself. But yeah, I'm super stoked.
Yeah,
Take it
me
away,
too.
Garrett.
I'll take you, Julie. Hey out there in Yoga Land. This is Dr. Garrett. Let's see. So I am a chiropractor. I've been doing that for almost 2 years. I think I got licensed in April, so like almost 2 years, and it'll be 2 years in April. I've been teaching, or no, I've been doing yoga for God, since high school. So that was like 12, 14 something years ago. So I've been doing yoga for a very long time, and kind of on and off, but a lot more serious within the last like 4 or 5 years now. And I've been teaching for almost 3 years. 3 years in February, I think, will be the mark there. So I really like kind of like having my foot in both of those worlds, because like being a chiropractor, I'm like in that exercise science world. And being a yoga teacher, I also get to see some of like the traditions, and I get to see some of the things that people say. And being able to kind of blend both has been my niche. It's like so much fun kind of weaving in movement that we wouldn't say is traditional yoga, or like someone might look at that and go, hey, that's not yoga. And then I always laugh and go, are you an expert on yoga? Are you Krishnamacharya? Did you somehow embody him and are now you telling how is this not yoga? People are mindful, people are breathing, people are having fun. Like, how is this? And that's one of the coolest things that science has been able to kind of show, is that you can make almost anything mindful, and therefore almost anything can be yoga if you're doing it mindfully, non-judgment in the moment. So I've had a pretty cool journey, and like really finding like and blending science and anatomy and biomechanics and fascia and just all these cool things into my classrooms. I also lecture for anatomy, and so like making things accessible is one of probably my biggest thing. Because anatomy is boring. Let's be honest. I think we all remember our teacher training, sitting through the Yoga Alliance mandated 7 hours, and just sitting there, just bored out of your mind when the teacher's just spouting muscle names or bone names, or oh, this is a ligament, this is a tendon. So I like to make things fun, and I have like a tiny version of a PowerPoint just to show you guys later to keep things on track, but to also give you a visual as to what we'll talk about. But yeah, I guess my journey to yoga. Yeah, I knew I was missing something. So I was a competitive swimmer in high school, like one of those like crazy 10,000 yards a day kind of swimmer. And I almost destroyed my shoulders. All that overhead activity of just swimming, like I got to a point where I was like a T-Rex. I couldn't even lift my arm up, and it was horrible. My swim coach's sister-in-law was a Pilates teacher. And so he told me, he was like, well, so I went to the doctor, and then my swim coach was like, hey, you should try Pilates. It'll help. Sure enough, cross-trained with Pilates, and my shoulder got so much better so quick. But Pilates is kind of expensive, and I ended up running out of like the allotted insurance amount or whatever. And so my swim coach was like, okay, now you should try yoga. And I went, yoga's for girls. I'm not going to go do yoga. And so he's like, just try it. And so I tried it, and I was like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I'm sore in places I don't even know exist. I am sweating profusely from like every pore in my body. What is this practice? And I just kept going back, and I got so addicted to it because it was like swimming. My mind was in it, my body was in it, and I was doing everything together, or yoked, as we say so commonly in yoga, right? And so I came from a world of injury. I came to yoga as a way to better my body because I was repeating a pattern that was not functional for me. And it ended up sparing me. I mean, it was really helpful, especially in chiropractic school with all the adjusting and all the dropping and all the shoulder stuff, just to have that under my belt too. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, as I'm hearing you share your story, there's Chinese ladies right outside talking about something. So
oh, cool.
bear with the random noises going on in my neck of the woods. But hearing about you talk about the swimming and then being able to be open to yoga, it's almost like you took your athleticism and you applied it to the yoga practice. Did you feel any bit of competitiveness or any of that?
Well, I live in Southern California, kind of like everyone here is a type A individual. So there definitely was an element of competition when I was first in class, because I was looking at it from, I didn't know the philosophy. I didn't know the tradition side. Like I was kind of like a outsider looking in. I was going to the local gym, the 24-hour fitness, and taking the yoga class there. So there's like not a lot of dogma, and it was more on the athletic side, like do this pose, do this pose, do this pose, do this pose. I remember looking at people in class going like, that guy's on 2 arms right now, and he's lifting his legs. I want to do that. And that's what I started doing. And then as I started to get better, and as I started to do it more, I started to go to like the more like yoga studios. And that's when I started getting more introduced into like the philosophy and stuff. And I mean, I'm still to this day a little bit more on the exercise world, where I look at things physically. I am a scientist, and sometimes the fluff, I like to make jokes, so I hope I don't offend anyone today, but my third eye rolls in some classes that just get like overly thematic or like overly fluffy, where my light needs to shine and my chakras need to come into alignment while I'm in lotus pose. I'm like, oh, what does that mean?
Like, I haven't seen a chakra before. Yeah. How do I...
What is this light? Am I turning into like some sort of lighthouse? Like, was I supposed to drink some water before class that I missed? Like, so it was kind of fun to approach it in that regard. And then like it's a metaphor, Garrett, is what a lot of my yoga friends will tell me. And I'm like, that's fine, but like, where's the authenticity? Like, what's the basis of this metaphor?
Yeah, I think one of the most enlightening things one of my favorite yoga teachers said was that he had never seen lightning shoot out of anyone's ass from being able to touch their toes with their fingers, or attaining nirvana from doing headstand. So
right.
it's okay if you don't obtain headstand in that one practice, because
I forgot. There's something similar too. I forgot who said it. It was like it's like we have this belief in yoga that getting your ankle behind your head will lead us to enlightenment.
So let's talk about the theme of today's talk, the theme
Yes,
of
the
hip
good stuff.
openers, because when I asked you about something you were excited to talk about, I remember that one of the previous science yoga Sunday talks, one of the attendees asked if one day we could talk about hip openers. And when I brought that up to you, your eyes lit up. You got very excited, and yeah, let's talk about it. And in my experience, in my yoga teacher training, I was told that all of the stress, all of the tension, all of the pent up emotions get placed in the hips. So we need
There's
to
that
open the
metaphor.
hips. Yeah, so we need to open the hips to allow all of that pent up energy to flow somewhere else. And after a couple of years of saying that, I started to question why I was saying it, because I just couldn't see it myself. So what is your stance on that?
Well, I think hip opening is probably one of the biggest yoga buzzwords that we have. If you go to Google right now and you type in hip opening, you will probably see close to 100 million articles from every which way on hip opening. And it'll all probably feature some similar poses that we'll discuss later. But it's common, it's a buzzword. And like what you said, I remember I had the same teachers that were like, the issues in your tissues will be released when you open your hips. And I always kind of took like a step back and went, well, first of all, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if you're a psychologist. I don't know if we should be releasing issues, because we're not quite certified to like deal with those if they are coming out. But I mean, they do have hips are like a source of trauma. Like some people have been traumatized, like both like physically trauma, like a direct impact kind of injury. There's sexual trauma involved with the hips. There's a lot of emotion that can be attached to that area. And so I can see why people would talk about it, and I could see why that could enter a class. But that's also like, you have to be careful with the words you're saying, because you could really, especially in this day and age, you can really emotionally trigger someone just by saying, oh, let your issues out by opening your knees wide into happy baby. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Let's keep things in for now and discuss kind of like what does opening even mean is a question I like to ask people, because we see all this hip opening, and opening is so vague, like super vague. It is. I asked this in teacher training, and I actually got this from Matthew Remski, and so it was really cool. I was a part right as I became a teacher, he had his like big webinar series on like injuries and stuff. And he posed 3 questions, and like 2 of them I use all the time in teacher trainings now, kind of because I'm a scientist. I like to see what people say, but also because it's eye-opening. It's like third eye level opening. So anyway, so asking people, what does open mean to you? What does tight mean to you? And you will get a myriad of answers. Like no one had, like you will obviously get some that are similar, right? But those words are so vague that they mean different things to different people. So especially in what I've seen with the responses, you can get like the, I picture that being metaphorically open. Like my soul is exposed. I'm vulnerable. I am confident, that kind of thing. But you also get into the physical realm of, well, I'll save the physical realm for a little bit later when we start discussing what opening actually is. But you do get into that, my knees wide kind of hip opening too. And then tightness is another one. Like some people say like, it means like I just feel constricted or I feel very stiff. Some people are like, ooh, it's that feeling that I get when I can't, like I'm at the end of the pose. And they're all valid responses. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to what hip opening actually means, because that's a question that's self-reliant. It's a question that has a you have an answer to it. And so like what I present, like if anyone listening in, take a second to like write down, what does opening mean to you? What does tight mean to you? Because it's pretty interesting. And then you can compare that to other people. Like next time you go to a studio or next time you see some of your yoga friends, ask them the same question and see if they have the same response as you, because it is so vague. It can mean anything. So when we look into, let me pull this up really quick. I know there might be some of you viewing, and so I'm a visual learner. I'm a big fan of looking at things rather than hearing things. And so here is a little PowerPoint. So like, what does hip opening even mean? Opening is vague. The other thing with hip opening that I found is that, which is the right screen. The other thing that hip opening that I found is what part are you, the hip has like 6 different ways that it moves. Here, and we'll get into the anatomy speak, but it can go front, back, side, inside, and then kind of spiral out versus spiral in. So there's 6 different ways you can open a hip. So be specific. What part of the hip, or what area, what motion are you doing to open the hip? Because there's 6 different ways to do it. Then, what part of the hip are you opening? Because the hip's got a bunch of different parts. You got a front, a back, an inside, an outside. Like, what part of your hip are you opening? So there's a little bit on the specific realm when it comes to like the vagueness of hip opening. So you could go into a hip opening workshop and that could seriously mean anything. Granted, it's probably going to mean one thing, and we'll discuss that in a second. Let me pull the screen back up.
In the meantime, Garrett, can you adjust your earbud, because the speaker appears to be brushing against something.
There we go.
Sweet.
I think the other one fell down. I think it was hitting the table.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see this again. So now there's another thing, and this was kind of introduced to me by Dr. Ginger Garner. Had a really good article on this and how like hip opening is kind of a bad word when it comes to yoga. The reason why I say it's a bad word is when I say hip opening, you probably immediately think of like a full-on like horse pose, a full-on like goddess pose where your body is open and at the end range, like your joints can no longer go further. So in saying hip opening, we kind of encourage like subtly people to go into like these super deep or like super quote unquote open poses. So now we're getting people into, all right, everyone, we're going to be opening our hips today in let's wheel pose. So now you're like, oh yeah, I can't wait. So you thrust your hips to the sky, you open your knees a little wider, you lift your back or your chest up to the ceiling too. Now you're in this beautiful looking pose. Might feel good too. Hopefully you prepared before you did it. And now you're at the end range. And what we found is that the end range is not a very stable place for your body. Your brain loves stability. It does not like being shaky. It does not like being threatened, because a threat to your body means that your brain is going to start locking things down. So that's kind of where tightness starts to come from. Tightness is a lot on the brain. Like your brain is going in and it's like, hey, my pelvis feels a little shaky. I'm going to tighten up my hip flexor. I'm going to tighten up my hamstring. I'm going to lock the area down, create some stability so that I don't just fall apart. That's kind of the goal. Your brain is always trying to keep you from falling apart. And if it perceives a threat and that could be emotional, that could be physical trauma, that could be just that, what I just described, instability, then it will lock things down and keep you from being open per se. So now we're loading at the end range. We might be creating some of this instability. And as a result, like we look really cool. We look really beautiful. Maybe your instructor came in and went, hey, good job, Julie. You looked awesome today in your hip opening pose. But you come, yeah, I know, right? And you cheer and you like take a quick Instagram selfie and you're like, hey, guess what? Look at what I did today. And now you go home and your pelvis is like, whoa, bro, what'd you do to me? So the language of opening can be dangerous, is I guess the point that I'm trying to make, because it will encourage end range. It will encourage people to go as far as they can into the pose, because that's what open kind of means, right? In yoga especially, we have this desire to be vulnerable, this desire to put ourselves into these positions that just feel liberating. And that's one of the best things about yoga, right? Is this ability to like thrust our chest into the sky, roll our shoulders back, and just be proud, be confident, be happy. So you have to be careful when you're saying hip opening, because it could encourage people to go too big, too fast, too strong, and you really can't stabilize at the end range. It's hard to do. Where you have like bone that could be hitting each other. You also have cartilage in your joints, and the cartilage is there for the cushion. That is what's keeping the bone from hitting the bone, enabling you to move and glide smoothly so that your body doesn't get damaged. But if this cartilage keeps hitting each other, or if you keep smacking bone on the cartilage, it gets inflamed, and inflammation eventually is arthritis, joint inflammation, arthritis. It's just the name. And you can end up, like, if this gets worse, and I mean diet, repetitive exercise, there's a lot of things that can exacerbate inflammation. It could lead to like hip injuries or like labral tears, hip impingement. I mean, we have people now, the ripe age of like 30, getting hip replacements because they're doing yoga. That is not a good thing. Hopefully anyone out there listening is like, that is not a good thing. There's a really good article that was published about this. I encourage you to look it up on Google. It's like if you just type in yoga injuries, I'm sure we have found that there's more hip injuries right now in yoga, and there's a lot of females especially that are getting injured because females have a little bit wider hip girth. They have a wider pelvis, and range of motion is a little bit more accessible, especially in the hips, to a female pelvis. So now we're going into these opening poses, these big realms, and we're slapping bone on bone, and we're slapping bone on cartilage. We're getting things inflamed, and it just doesn't end well for the body. I mean, we only have a set amount of cartilage. We only have a set amount of bone. And if we inflame it too much, then we really can injure ourselves and end up getting something replaced. That's a long, dark road. A hip replacement often leads to another hip replacement. Another hip replacement often leads to a knee replacement. And it's kind of like a slippery slope of just things getting parts replaced because we went too big, too strong in yoga, all because we wanted to open ourselves and we lacked the control to do so. That was a lot of...
Wow. I'm very astonished at all the info you're saying. I think the one sentence you said that struck me the hardest was hip replacement at age 30.
Oh,
that's such a young age. I mean, that's something that when I hear hip replacement, I think someone in their late 70s or someone who's fully retired from their day job, you know, and to hear things like that happening, it makes me afraid to practice something like lotus pose. You know, I mean, that's probably...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a little scary. And part of it is because of the extremes that we place on the hips in yoga. I mean, we're constantly opening our knees as wide as we can. We're constantly lifting our hips or lunging really deeply into poses. And you have a set amount of times things can hit each other until eventually they just get pissed off and inflamed. And then eventually you just keep doing it. And now things break down. And that's what we were finding. I mean, there's a lot of hip injuries when it comes to yoga. I mean, I encourage you to ask your friends or ask your colleagues or you can probably even ask your class, like, hey, whoever has felt an injury in their hip and have it related to yoga. And you might be surprised at what you see because it's fairly common and it's not something that gets talked about a lot because in yoga in itself is kind of a healthy practice. Yoga, we also like to talk a lot about the light of things or like the positivity of things. And when injuries start to drip in, we either kind of disassociate it. We're like, oh, that wasn't yoga that hurt my hip. I was out gardening today and I probably squat weird and I pinched my hip pulling weeds in my garden. When in fact, you just kept your knees super locked out when you forward folded and you just like slant or pulled your hamstrings and really aggravated things. So like, sometimes we just don't know that yoga could be the cause of this pain, but also looking at some of the things that cause pain, like the big extremes, but also the repetitive nature of some of these extremes, and not listening to your body is probably the biggest thing. Like if you're doing something that hurts, or if you're doing something that's painful, or that was redundant. If you're doing something that hurts, or if you're doing something that's uncomfortable, don't do it, or modify so that doesn't happen. And there is still some of the old yoga mindset of like no pain, no gain. That is horrible. If a teacher tells you that push through the pain or breathe through the pain, please find another teacher, because that is not good advice. You should never be pushing through pain. Pain is your body or your brain telling you, hey, something is wrong, please change it. Pain is a signal for change. And if you ignore that, then things can get really bad, because you're ignoring like your number one warning sign that something's wrong.
Yeah, I was in Spain. I was taking a Mysore style Ashtanga class. I was there a couple of days a week, and the teacher had one of her students assisting, and part of the assisting meant they would help adjust the student. And I was in Marichiyasana D. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it is a bind. You're bending one leg, you're trying to bend the other, you're trying to wrap around and reach one hand to grab the other. And
it's like a forward fold spinal twist.
Yeah, forward fold spinal twist pretzel asana.
Yeah, there you go.
It was also painful asana, because I had felt that moment where I had to just yelp. I yelped out, you know, and the student got so frightened, and he said, oh, okay, it's just, yeah, you're just not open today. You're just not open today.
There's another way that you can use it, right? Like, oh, your body just isn't to the level. Like you needed to do more, you needed to open more during class. You just half-assed it up until this point, obviously. But like that, the other side of that too is like we get people that yelp out in pain in class, and sometimes the teacher goes, yes, that's the pain leaving your body, keep going. And you're like, no, if you're yelping to pain, you already went too far. Dial it back a little bit, control things. Like if you're at end range, the only time you should ever really be at end range is for like a therapeutic benefit, because that is when we start, like me as a doctor or like a PT or like some sort of manual therapist, like even like a personal trainer. No, I guess they can't really lay hands on people. People that can manually assist, that are legally allowed to, they can get you to end range for therapeutic. Like you need to restore your ankle in like bringing your toes to your shin, ankle dorsiflexion. So I can come in and I can kind of push your foot a little bit more at the end range to kind of get it to go further. So I'm turning off the brakes on the brain, and then you have to go in and you have to strengthen it, because once you open something, so that's another thing in yoga. Once you open something, if you don't do anything with that new range of motion, it will go back to what it was. That's why after yoga, like have you ever had like a Netflix session where you like you're like, oh, that was the best class ever. I'm going to go home. Maybe I'll drink a glass of wine. I'll sit on the couch. You watch like 3 hours of like a TV, and then you get up and you're like the stiffest person imaginable. That's because you sat down and you didn't use the range of motion. So you kind of returned back to the state that you were in before your class, because if you don't use it, you lose it. And your brain just went, okay, we were open, you know, we were very like mobile. Let's use open as like synonymous as mobile for this case. So now you're very open, now you're very mobile, and you sat down and you got stiff again. Well, that's normal. Your brain went, okay, you weren't like going around, you weren't grabbing, you weren't pulling, you weren't running, you weren't doing anything with this range of motion. So why do you need to keep it? I locked this down for a reason. Don't you know that? The brain is an interesting thing.
What would you recommend someone do after they extend their end range of motion?
So like strength training. So yeah, a lot of it's going to fall back down to if you are really therapeutically opening something. And I mean opening in the context of mobility. Like I just opened up my shoulder because I need it more mobile in any kind of range of motion. Okay, well, you opened it. Now you need to, like, I think it was Patrick Beach. You create space to fill it with strength. So that's one of the things that yoga kind of lacks, or at least in a lot of people's practices, is like a strength practice. Like we have this big lengthening, opening world, and we're constantly stretching things. And I tell this to my teacher trainers all the time. Like you have a rubber band, right? And if you keep pulling that rubber band, it'll snap back. But eventually, if you keep doing that, it'll lose some of this elasticity. It's not going to go back to the tighter version of the rubber band. And you're going to keep pulling it, you're going to keep pulling it, and then eventually what? That rubber band's going to snap. That rubber band is a lot like your connective tissue, your ligaments, your tendons, your fascia. And so you can keep opening and opening and opening, but if without restoring tension back to the network, what do you think is going to happen? You're eventually going to snap. Your hamstring's going to tear, your labrum's going to get torn, you can get hip impingement. Like there's a lot of different things that can equate to that kind of like snapping because of too much stretching or too much end range loading, I guess would be a good way to say that too. So you would want to fill it with strength. So kind of the traditional model, and one of my favorite doctors, Stop Chasing Pain, Dr. Perry Nicholson, he has a really cool like saying where he's like, the hardware and the software of the brain, like what your brain responds best to when it comes to mobility is opening something up. So creating mobility and then strengthening it. So doing something that now utilizes that range of motion. And there's a lot of different ways. I mean, you could do like, say I'm doing like a wrist mobility exercise, right? I would then want to like maybe like grab a weight or a TheraBand or a resistance band and like start strengthening it now with resistance. Then I would want to do like global stuff where now I'm incorporating that new length of my wrist in with my shoulder. And then I would probably want to do something that's like full body so that maybe I'm like squatting and holding a kettlebell in my hand. So now you have to use the range of motion in a bunch of different ways if you ever want to lock it down and make it permanent. Is the point that I guess I'm making there. Other than that, you're just lengthening to this point of snapping almost, where you're just losing tension in your body. I mean, your ligaments, they don't really go back if they get like overly pulled out or overly stretched. And you ask someone with hypermobility, that's what we see in a lot of the hypermobile people. Like they've stretched themselves to the extreme to where now everything feels like it's falling apart. Like they lay down in bed. Like I just had a patient that I was talking to about hypermobility, and she laid down. Every time she'd lay down in bed, she would wake up within, sometimes it was like 30 minutes, sometimes it was like 3 hours, but she would wake up with just an extreme amount of pain, body, your brain telling you, hey, something's wrong, please change something. And what it was her body would relax while she was sleeping, and it would start to hurt because it like fell apart. It lost some of the tension that the muscles were using to like hold everything in because we lost ligamentous tension. So for a lot of hypermobile people, it comes down into definitely don't end range. You need to refine what the range that you already have and then put it some strength. So make sure the muscles are tense, make sure the muscles are engaged in the pose. And that's where a lot of the end range people kind of fall short, is like, hey, look, I can open my knees as wide as this. Don't I look pretty? But how engaged are you? Like, how stable are you? That's what really matters. And especially if you're trying to practice yoga for longevity. Like, if you want to really practice yoga for the rest of your life, you need to have some strength in your practice. And that could just be augmenting the lengthy practice with weights or resistance. Pilates is another great adjunct to yoga. Or just incorporating more muscle recruitment, more muscle engagement in poses. And so like my classes, especially, like I'm a very strength-based teacher. Like I don't care that your heart's open. I don't care if your hips are open. And I want you to feel strong and I want you to feel stable. And that is something that I've found resonates with a lot of the hypermobile people, because they're constantly being encouraged to go big, go open. And now it's like, I'm telling you, no, refine, come back to starting, come back to center. And then now go out just a tiny bit. Now squeeze, clench, outside, inside, front, back, everything. Feel the whole body in the pose. Feel the duality. What's the front doing versus the back? What's the side doing? What is the other side? You know, you should be able to feel everything. And even Iyengar kind of taught that, you know, real yoga starts when you balance all things. And I think he like pointed to each and every individual like side of his finger when posed that question. So it was pretty cool that like even the ancient traditional yogis were kind of teaching this kind of thing, but we like to look good. We like to look open. We like to feel open. And a lot of times like we have to see it to believe it rather than feel it. And we'll get into the feeling in just a moment when we actually describe like what does hip opening actually do. I know we kind of got tangented there for a second.
Well, I was just thinking that the hashtag yoga every damn day might need to be adjusted to yoga every other day.
Yeah. No, oh my God,
Hashtag
no.
Pilates once a week. Hashtag elasticity training.
You know what's funny? Among like the yoga anatomy circle, there we have the hashtag yoga every third day is kind of our saying, because you got to have cardio. Yoga is not cardio. Sorry, everyone listening. It's not really cardio. Even if you're doing power yoga, even if you're doing vinyasa, your heart rate doesn't get up that much compared to running. It does not get that much compared to like even a treadmill or anything. I'm sorry if I just broke someone's heart. Yoga is not cardio. Please go run. Please augment your body with multiple ways of movement. So that's the other thing. Like yoga doesn't have cardio, and yoga often lacks strength exercise. And you need both to have a strong, resilient body. Like that's what our human body was meant to do, by the way, run and walk. Back in the day when we were like cavemen, we would run and walk like 10 to 15 miles a day. We're lucky now if we walk 10 to 15 minutes a day. So like making sure that you're getting everything, strength, mindfulness, and mobility, and that's yoga. And then cardio, like making sure that you have, like I call it the 3 tenets of healthy movement: cardio, resistance exercise, and then something that's more like mindful and also mobility based. Because you can't have all this it's like the classic guy at the gym, right? He like, hey, can you touch your nose? And he can't even touch his nose because his bicep's too big. He lacks mobility. So like, I mean, there's definitely a flip side to all of this. I mean, there's a lot of people that do a lot of running that don't have any mobility practice or any strength practice. So it's just finding balance is ultimately what the key is. And like, maybe it's just running, or maybe it's just walking for 10 minutes every other day, putting in an hour or 2 at the gym once or twice a week, and then going to yoga your 3 or 4 times, whatever you like to do. And like daily asana too, like you don't have to, as long as it's not the same every day. That's the other thing. Like if you're doing the same thing every day, that just is going to breed repetition. I mean, you could have perfect alignment doing the same thing every day, and you could end up just breaking down. You have to mix things up. It keeps things interesting, 1, and 2, it keeps you engaged. It keeps you challenging your body in multiple vectors.
You know, people thought about having an activity buffet. That might be a fun way to look at it. You know, instead of going to hometown buffet, you go to activity buffet. You got the yoga as the appetizer, and then you have Pilates as one of the courses, and then you have hiking and swimming.
Exactly. Oh my God, if you ever come back to California, we should open a gym called the Movement Buffet or something. That would be awesome.
No food at this buffet, just awesome movement.
Exactly. All right, so let's I know we're getting close to time. Let's talk a little bit more about hip opening again. So physically open is what we kind of refer to when we talk about hip opening. And that's like your figure 4 position, or what you would see in like a wide forward fold. You know, your legs are wide. Let me pull up the PowerPoint so those of you can see what I mean here. Oh, whoops. I should probably screen share first. Okay, there we go. So hip opening can create an imbalance, because what we're often associating with hip opening is hip flexion, which is bringing your knee forward, like towards your stomach, hip abduction, which is bringing your knee kind of out to the side, and then external rotation, which is kind of bringing your knee to rotate to the side of your body with your foot turned in. So like a good classic example would be like a tree pose, with the lifted leg being that example of like flexion, abduction, and external rotation. And I think we can all agree that's what we think of. Like Supta Baddha Konasana here, like right on my screen, is an excellent example of that hip stuff. But what really ends up happening, and so from a therapeutic realm, if you're really trying to open a hip, you're going to get a greater gain in mobility out of extension, which is bringing your leg behind you, adduction, which is bringing your knee, I guess towards your other knee would be a good way to describe that. And then internal rotation, which is bringing your knee inside with your foot more bowed out. And what's really interesting is that there are not a lot of yoga poses that are biased this way. 1 second. Oh, there we go. So there's not a lot of yoga poses that, like, we have a lot of imbalance when it comes to hip flexion. I mean, we got like chair pose. We got so many poses that do hip flexion. Not a lot of poses with hip extension. And then the ones that we do in hip extension, usually we're going super deep, like a crescent lunge, Anjaneyasana being a really good example of that. Oh, hey, kitty.
Yeah, my cat decided to join us for yoga chat. There you go.
It's not a yoga cat unless the cat, or it's not a yoga chat unless the cat's involved. So anyway, so finding especially internal rotation can be like more than beneficial when it comes to mobility gains. And the reason for this is developmental anatomy. And so let me screen share one more time so you guys can see this at home. When we look at how the body develops, like back when we're a fetus, like in the belly of our mom, we are kind of like, we start off as like one cell and we become the human that we are today, basically. And so in that like 4 to 8 week period, we get these things called limb buds, where they're tiny little stumps that are kind of forming. And the way that they form is very interesting. You can see that over here on the one on the right, where they kind of open up. So like shoulders, for instance, will open to external rotation. So they kind of start in like an internal, like everything towards the chest. And then as you're developing, they unfold and become external. The hips are opposite. So the hips start kind of in that wide position. Like another good way to describe that, which I also find is pretty funny, is like man spreading, right? Where there's that huge trend right now, like, oh, man spreading. Like the guy sits down on the bus and he sets his legs out really wide, and now I'm really uncomfortable because I have to sit really small. So like you kind of start off in that position, like horse pose, knees wide, feet in. But as we develop, the knees turn more in, and internal rotation is kind of the plane in which they end up in. And so what ends up happening is the first motion that your brain will lock down when it comes to your shoulders is external rotation. And you can see that on a lot of people, like bringing your arm up beyond your head. And let me tilt the camera here. Like lifting like that is kind of hard for a lot of people. And then bringing your knee in. So like a hero's pose is like everyone's hated pose, right? We hear hero's pose in class and we all go, oh no. That pose, oh man, that pose is a good one, but with support. Please put support underneath your butt, because it's just asking for some knee injuries. That's a tough pose. Sidebar aside, anyway, so putting internal rotation back into yoga is really beneficial, because this is primal. This is like what you were doing. This is the yoga you were doing as a fetus. Like when things were forming, you were doing internal rotation in your hips. You were doing external rotation in your shoulders. So what we find now, especially as like a manual therapist, like in restoring internal rotation, we get the best mobility gains. Like you will find it's so cool to see, but like almost everything improves. You're like, oh man, I can't bring my knee out a lot today. I'm feeling really, really tight. Well, do the opposite. Put some internal rotation in, and then you might find that your knee opens up. It's really cool, like what can happen in terms of mobility gains. And that's because this is the first movement that your brain learned. Hence why it's the first movement that it's now locking down. It's like, oh, I'm going back default programming. I'm going to lock down what I know, and that's internal rotation in the head. So once you start restoring that, and so fascinating enough, we always get people with tight hamstrings, right? We always get people with tight IT bands. Like we hear that all the time. One, hamstrings is a little more sign of like pelvic instability or like lumbar instability. There's a lot of things that go into that. That's another Science Yoga Sunday for another day. So, but the TFL, so the tensor fasciae lata, is this tiny little muscle, kind of like right where your pocket is in your pants. That muscle becomes or kind of merges into the IT band, and that muscle will control internal rotation. So it's not actually like doing internal rotation, but it's limiting it. Because remember, we have like a muscle that's contracting to do a motion, but you also have the other muscle that's allowing that motion to occur. So you have to you look into this and you're like, yoga doesn't have a lot of internal rotation. We have all these people with tight IT bands. Like maybe if we put some internal rotation back in, we wouldn't be feeling this feeling, because the IT band is going to be kind of related to what is going on with the lateral line from the ear to the heel, the side line of muscles that are all connected, but also the TFL and how that's relationship with your IT band. And a lot of times sitting puts it in a state where it's like stuck kind of long. Now you're going into all these like hip openers where your knee's going out, Supta Baddha style, and you're putting it concentric, so short. but we're never putting it in its like fully lengthened, like fully eccentric state. Now, one other thing in yoga that's really good to discern, eccentric or lengthening, it does not mean relaxation. Like I've seen so many teachers say, okay, now like open up and relax. That's not quite what's going on. Like you are never really relaxed. The only time you're ever truly relaxed is when you're dead, unfortunately.
Real talk. Hashtag truth.
Yeah, hashtag. So anyway, finding that like bit of tension and allowing that motion to control. So now, like going back to internal rotation, like what poses do this? There's not a lot. I said that a couple times and now I'm elaborating. We have like warrior one on your back leg is that common one that we kind of cue it, where you're kind of spinning your back leg in, right? That's hard. I don't know if you guys remember your first yoga class where that was introduced, but did you understand that concept? I doubt it. I like, even to this day, I find it's hard to do. It's a strange position to do it. It's not very isolated. So the other one would be like pigeon pose. Like the back leg is also kind of capable of kind of spiraling in a little bit into internal rotation. And that can be a really good adjunct to your back leg in a Kapotasana. But anyway, like incorporating more internal rotation, especially as like a warm-up, can make a difference when it comes to what we perceive as hip opening or gaining mobility when it comes to yoga. So I've actually like this topic really fascinates me because I don't find a lot of hip opening, or I find a lot of internal rotation, like true internal rotation poses. I mean, like hero's pose, revolved triangle would probably be another good one. But I mean, revolved triangle is a little skeptical because that's a big pose. And that one often requires a lot of prep to get to. So looking at things and making them accessible is for anyone. Because, I mean, a lot of yoga, I mean, we look back in the past. It was created in the 1930s for slender Indian boys. And now we're applying it to modern humans that sit all day. These guys are not the same. My anatomy is different than their anatomy. Your anatomy is different than my anatomy. And we have to do something that's more accessible. We have to be able to modify poses to modern people. And so some of these poses where we have that traditional kind of internal rotation going on, we have to realize that that person might not be able to have the frame of reference, might not be able to figure out how to activate that. So you have to find a way to incorporate it that's a little easier, especially like more towards the warm-up. So like, let's see. So here are some of my favorite poses. Let me screen share again, that do internal rotation. So deer pose. Not a lot of people have ever heard about deer pose, first of all. Deer pose is probably one of the best poses in all of yoga. And it's so underrated. So this lady right here is in deer pose, which finding a Google image search on deer pose was extremely hard. There's like 4 images. But anyway, so you see here's your traditional kind of figure 4 leg in the front leg. But check out what this back leg's doing. It's internal rotation. So it's in like a wider version of hero's pose. And you're also kind of tilted off to the side. So it's allowing for a little more motion, making it a little more accessible. And then with deer pose, oh my God, there's so many cool things. You can fold over the front leg. You can twist off to the side there. So on this lady, it would be her right side. She could fold that way. You could even recline back like you would in like that reclined hero's pose to get a little more internal rotation there. Another one is like a reverse figure 4 twist. So we have like the cross your leg over your other leg while you're laying on your back, and then lower your foot to one side. Well, it's kind of cool for the one leg, but if you go the other way, you'll feel that like right on your pocket, like right on your TFL that I just discussed. And that, oh my God, that is such a nice pose. I love that one. And then this is, I call this one collapsed bridge pose. I often start my class in this pose. So I lay people on their back and they just relax on their back. I have them place a block between their knees and then walk their feet as wide as what's comfortable. And so I like the common cue is like your legs look like a letter M. And what's really nice is you can kind of settle in. You can settle into internal rotation, and you can start that unlocking procedure and telling your brain like, hey, I'm going to be moving my hips today. And the most beneficial movement I can make is internal rotation in the beginning. Let's put that in there so that I have my full range as I'm going through. I'm safely engaged. Because on a final note, internal rotation being a primal motion, being like one of the first things your hips learn, is connected to primal chains, mainly like the posterior chain. Like there's a really cool thing where you lay on your back, your feet towards the sky, and then from your hips, and that's the hardest part to initiate, you kind of twist your toes, like your big toes towards each other. and you'll feel like your back curl up. That's that network. So you're internally rotating by bringing the feet together, and it's activating your posterior chain, which is like lifting your spine, creating spinal curves, and engaging all the muscles along your back body. And in this day and age, posterior chain is another big buzzword because people sit all the time. Back to one of my favorite doctors, Dr. Perry Nicholson. He has a saying: chairs kill your ass, chairs kill your psoas, chairs kill your soul. And it's very true. And so activating internal rotation will in turn activate your butt, because your glutes are actually, some parts of your glute will control and also work with internal rotation. So you also have like, you're activating all the major hip stabilizers and major hip movers, creating like a safer, more stable position for the pelvis and the sacrum. And so now you've started off in like the first 5 minutes of your class, initiating internal rotation and creating this realm of stability to do yoga in for the rest of your hour, your 90 minutes, your 2 hours, however long your class is. And it's really, really cool and very helpful, especially for hypermobile people, to kind of understand and learn. And you'll find a lot of people have a hard time with internal rotation. A lot of people have a hard time with that because we're always man spreading. I mean, even when we sit down, we sit and like cross one leg over the other, figure four, or like the more beveled hips of like actually like knee over knee kind of crossing. So putting in some internal rotation can really make a difference, especially for people that sit a lot. I just said a lot of things.
Garrett's on a roll.
Yeah. Oh my God. You got me on a tangent and I just started rolling with it.
And the fact that sitting is an action that's not very good, that most people working in a corporate setting are doing for on average 8 hours at least. And if you're working in a startup, you're probably sitting for a lot longer. And I understand that's why some new companies are having standing tables now. Tables where people just stand.
Yeah.
Because
those are pretty cool. Those are pretty cool. Well, and I work, when it comes to my class, I work on a pretty firm principle, and it's an assumption, but I assumed that you probably were sitting before you entered my class. Granted, I do live in Southern California, the commuter capital of the world. So you probably were in your car sitting to drive to my class. And then before class, you were probably sitting on the ground, waiting in the lobby or waiting on the floor. So like, if you work based on where are people at when they enter your room, now how can you bring them out of that state to that neutral state that we tend to practice yoga from? Now bring them to that realm that you want to bring them to. So you have to kind of address like, do you live in New York? Are people walking to your class? Okay, then what can I do that kind of brings them out of walking room to more like a yoga base, like a more neutral? Like how can you bring people back to center and then now expand them out to your theme or your movements, your yoga, whatever you're trying to teach that day? And I think that that's like a really good concept to apply to your class and a really good kind of take home to what we discussed today. Because a lot of people, we kind of forget about like life before the mat, life after the mat. But there is like 24 hours in the day. And one of those was probably the yoga class. What's going on in the other 23? And how can you better people's life in that 23 hours?
Oh, but my other cat, just, you can see his tail on the side.
You have a whole party going on.
Yeah, it's a cat party. Cats they love to come by when yoga's happening. But I totally agree with you about the remaining 23 hours in the day. When I used to teach, I would see students come in and they really were treating the hour as if it was not a spa treatment, but just that 1 hour that they didn't have to think. They just wanted to be told what to do.
Well, that's awesome. That's important.
Yes, it is. It's really important to be able to mention is that they're able to take what they're learning in that hour or 75 minutes or even 90 minutes to carry that to the rest of their day to practice that mindfulness. And when they're dealing with the next thing, once they set foot out of the yoga studio, life happens again.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Resume. I mean, the noise, the driving, the sitting, it all comes back. I mean, you can only escape for so long, right? But yoga is the thing that helps us manage that. So I guess like really at the end of the day, one of the questions that I have for anyone listening is, when it comes to hip opening, like it's kind of vague, right? It might not mean what we're intending it to mean. And if we are going into the meaning of mobility, then the position that we might be opening in might not be conducive to what we think we're doing. So the larger question is, like, should we even be using the term hip opener? Is hip opener a bad word? And I'm not here to demonize anything. The last thing I would ever want to do ever is demonize or condemn movement. Like, if something feels good and if something feels right, if it resonates to you, then do it, because that has intrinsic value, even if people are telling you don't. So do what works. Question everything, because everything, who knows at the end of the day? I mean, we might have a scientist come up in the next 5 years that's like, hip opening and external rotation is the greatest thing that you could ever do. And I will gladly read the research and then be like, I'm sorry, everybody, I was wrong. But until then, like, it is so important to like start brushing up on some of these concepts and start weaving in things that are for modern humans versus the 1930s humans that started yoga, that we're kind of basing this modern practice off of. And then at the end of the day too, like, if you like to use the word hip opener, do it, but be authentic in what you're saying. Like, what are you opening? What part are you opening? You don't have to get into the anatomy with your class. You can just, in your sequencing, in your theming, like, talk about it. And then, are you implementing the all 6 ranges? Like, are you bringing the knee forward? Are you bringing it back? Are you bringing it out to the sides? Are you bringing it in? Are you rotating it out? Are you rotating it in? Because you should be moving it in all 6 directions to truly be opening it. And that's where that imbalance occurs. We're throwing our knees out to the side all the time, thinking that's hip opening. And it's not. We have other directions that we have to open, and they're more beneficial too, to do some things in those other directions. And that's really what I hope the listeners take home today. I know it's on the Rogue side, hence why we're on the Rogue Yogi Science Yoga Sunday. But this is the kind of line of thinking that can progress yoga and keep people safe, keep people doing it, keep people protected and feeling good. Because throwing your knee out to the side all the time, it's not going to end well, especially if it's at end range, especially if you're doing it every day. So, like, just be safe. Don't do things that hurt. Don't do things that are uncomfortable, even if your teacher's telling you. And feel good in your body at the end of the day, and even in what you're saying. And I think that's my message. I think that's the take home.
And then Garrett took the yoga block and dropped it and walked off
Boom.
the stage. Like, this yoga block dropped.
Oh,
and there's Bowie.
Oh, I wish I would have planned that. That would have been pretty cool.
Well, that was very insightful. That was a lot of knowledge being dropped. And I think that the phrase hip opening, at least some people watching this video can reframe their thinking around it now. And I think what's great is that Garrett created a nice hip warm-up flow video for all of us to be able to watch and practice whenever we can. So the link is in the box below the video, but I'll also email it to everyone watching the replay so that you guys can enjoy that video. So
yeah,
thanks very much. Yeah.
It's a cool one. It's a good warm-up. Gets you all 6 ranges. It's what they use in like martial arts and stuff like that. So it's used in other styles of movement. It's like, oh, people love it too. It's kind of fun.
I actually practiced it myself. And as I watched the video, I thought, oh, that looks really easy. And then when I did it, I realized how much of this controlled movement I wasn't doing.
See, so that's the thing. Control the movement. Like, oh, you can bring your knee behind your head. Okay, cool. But can you control doing that? Like, were you breathing the whole time you did that? Like, there's so many cool things that happen with stability and strength.
Yeah.
Oh, cat to the face.
Yeah, I think the cats are trying to let us know that we are wrapping up this awesome chat.
I know, we could end up talking all day if we're not careful.
So,
I gotta get to work too.
We'll thank the cats, and also thank you, Garrett, for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you're about to teach a class in Huntington Beach, and I think that this passion that you have, people can feel it, I can feel it, and I hope that at least one person learns something new about the way they think about their hips.
Well, thank you, Julie. I really enjoyed being here, and I really what you're doing is going to change the world. So I'm really appreciative for it. I'm sure there's others listeners that are like, this is awesome. I'm so enlightened now.
Yes, enlightenment, but not lightening out your butt.
I know, right? My chakras are so balanced right now. And I'm not even in lotus pose.
No. All right, guys.
All right.
Well, thanks very much.
Have a good one,
Thank you,
everybody.
Garrett.